Now just hold it right there. I already know what you're going to say. You're going to say Loki doesn't deserve to be this high up on the list. That Loki is a Phase 4 project, guilty of all the sins of the Phase 4 projects. And I'd agree with you. I'd even go so far to say that Loki is the biggest sinner in the Phase 4. And why don't we go over those sins? And then I'll explain to you why Loki is number 13 on this list. The Loki series was pitched to us as the Loki we know, traveling through time and the multiverse, getting into adventures, and meeting alternate versions of himself. What we got was Loki being Owen Wilson's sidekick, until the story brought us to our real protagonist, Sylvie, who's a female version of Loki. And there's the bait and switch. They told us that this show was going to be about Loki, so we assumed that it was our Loki. But surprise! Silly viewers, this show is called Loki because of this female version of Loki, not the Loki you know. The Loki you know is only in this show to help the TVA bring down Sylvie. That is until he joins Sylvie to take down the TVA. Going from Owen Wilson's sidekick to Sylvie's sidekick. But it's Sylvie's mission to take down the TVA and the people that created it. And once she finds out the timekeepers were fake and it was all a ruse, she hunts down the man actually responsible and kills him, supposedly making all the multiverse shenanigans of Phase 4 possible. There's no doubt about it. This is Sylvie's story. Marvel just didn't have the balls to make a story about an unknown character. So they took one of our favorite characters and slapped his name on Sylvie's story, so that everyone would come and watch. And their plan worked. And while I disagree with Marvel's bait and switch tactic, you shouldn't trick people. I don't have a problem with Loki's part in this show. Loki isn't a leading man or a hero. He's either a villain or Thor's mischievous brother / sidekick. So Loki slipping into the sidekick role of the protagonist of this story seems natural. What doesn't seem natural is these two Lokis kissing. I mean, really? This is worse than a brother and sister kissing, isn't it? I know Loki's a narcissist, but this goes a bit far. Now let's talk about the other bait and switch, the one not many people are talking about. And that's the fact that this Loki is not our Loki. The Loki in this series isn't the man that gave his life for the small chance of saving his brother and the rest of his people. No, this is the Loki that wanted to enslave humanity and unleashed an alien army onto the people of Earth. He also threw Tony Stark out a window. The point is, the Loki in this series isn't the anti-hero Loki. He's the villain Loki. He didn't experience the grief of losing both of his parents. He didn't make the decision to almost sacrifice himself for his brother. He never came to an understanding or friendship with his brother. And he didn't risk his life to save the Asgardian people. It was all these adventures that changed Loki from the villain in the original Avengers movie to the guy who sacrificed himself in Avengers Infinity War. Now, because Disney doesn't want you rooting for someone who just ripped out someone's eyeball, they show Loki a movie of all the important events that I mentioned earlier. And the audience is just supposed to accept that years of character development can be instilled by just watching a movie. And that this is now the lovable Loki, not the mass murdering Loki. And I'm calling shenanigans. You don't stop being a genocidal maniac by watching a movie. Unless that movie's Point Break. Point Break will change your life, I swear to God. Let's start this segment off by explaining what the TVA does. They protect what's known as the sacred timeline. They make sure that the choices everyone everywhere makes keeps history moving in this one direction, preventing the formation of a multiverse and taking away all free choice. And they do this by what's called pruning. When a choice is made that creates a variant timeline, the TVA shows up and completely destroys that timeline and everyone in it. And that's why the TVA came after Loki. When the future Avengers knocked over the Tesseract and Loki was able to escape with it, he created a new timeline. And the TVA erased that timeline and brought Loki up on trial. And now that you're caught up to speed, let's get down to my problem. The TVA tells Loki that he's on trial for interrupting the timeline. And rightfully so. Loki asks, well, what about the Avengers? They traveled all through time. And the TVA's response is, the Avengers were supposed to do that. And now I have multiple questions that need answering. The only way to create continuity between Endgame and the Loki series is if the TVA went and pruned every location the Avengers took an Infinity Stone from. Meaning the Ancient One was right about the timeline splitting, but what she didn't know was the TVA was going to erase her anyway. And returning the stones would be impossible, because those branches of time wouldn't exist anyway. But that's not what happened, because the TVA only erased Loki taking the Tesseract and escaping. And if he doesn't escape, then who does 2012 Captain America think he's fighting when he fights the future Captain America? And why was 2023 Captain America surprised that 2012 Captain America showed up? He should have remembered this encounter and wondered why. He thought that he was fighting Loki when Loki had never escaped. And my biggest question, what were the ramifications of Captain America finding out that Bucky was alive in 2012, rather than during the events of Captain America the Winter Soldier? Pruning events like Captain America fighting himself would be the only thing that would make sense and keep the timeline continuous. Otherwise, Tony Stark should have a memory of having a heart attack after the Battle of New York. But we know these events weren't pruned, because Captain America does go back in time and return the stones. And since the TVA makes sure there's only one timeline, Captain America definitely fought himself in the 616. And he should have memory of it. And since Steve Rogers doesn't remember this, it makes a pretty big plot hole in the Loki series. As a matter of fact, the harder you think about time travel and the multiverse in the Loki series, the less it will make sense. It's best just to turn your brain off. Come to think of it, if it's the TVA's job to prune variants so they don't screw up the timeline, why did they let Steve Rogers go back to the 1940s and live out his days as a variant? This, along with a lot of other things, are example of how the Loki series sets up rules and then breaks those rules, causing nothing they're presenting to make sense. Even though this is only the Loki we know, because the writers fast-forwarded his character development. And even though this show is really about Sylvie, not Loki. And even though this show creates more questions than it ever could give answers, both for this series and for the Marvel Universe at large. The ambition and imagination it takes to introduce the concepts that they've introduced in the Loki series. Makes up for any holes you can poke in the series. They introduced us to the TVA and everything that came with it. They introduced us to the multiverse and the secret timeline. They introduced us to the concept of variants and a lot of cool Loki variants. They introduced us to He Who Remains, my favorite part of the show. And they introduced us to Sylvie and her backstory. And the show did it in a fun, entertaining way that mostly made sense. And when you're throwing out this many interesting, complex concepts, I can forgive the inevitable mistakes.